They didn't knock like neighbors. They didn't knock like delivery men. They pounded on my door like executioners demanding blood. At 7 a.m., when most families are just pouring coffee and kids are still half asleep, my house became a battleground. 4 men in dark jackets stamped with HOA inspector barged in, waving fake documents and quoting fake laws. And in the middle of my living room, they set their eyes on my 15-year-old son. They claimed they had authority to take him for a so-called inspection. Imagine watching strangers with tattoos crawling up their arms drag your child toward the door while your neighbors just stood there, believing every word. That's how it began. But what they didn't know was that Navy SEALs were drinking coffee in my kitchen. The first sound was so violent it rattled the silverware in the drawers. Bang, bang, bang. The entire front door quivered as if it might snap off its hinges. My wife, Sarah, dropped the wooden spoon she was holding into the sink. The clatter drowned out by another round of pounding. Her wide eyes darted to me, and her lips moved without sound before she finally whispered, "John, who is that? It's barely 7 in the morning." I didn't answer right away. My instincts, honed years ago in places far from suburban lawns and cul-de-sacs, were already screaming. This wasn't a friendly knock. It wasn't a package delivery. This was the kind of pounding that carried threat, not request. Each slam reverberated through the walls, echoing like a battering ram. "Open up, HOA inspection." A harsh male voice barked through the door. The tone was sharp, commanding, like an officer barking orders to a subordinate. Another voice followed, lower and colder. Immediate compliance required. "Open this door now, or we escalate." Sarah clutched her robe tighter around herself, her knuckles whitening. "John, that doesn't sound like the HOA. That sounds like I know," I muttered, cutting her off. "Stay here. Don't move." Each step I took toward the door felt heavier than the last, the pounding matching the rhythm of my pulse. I had faced men with weapons before, men who looked you in the eye and dared you to flinch. But this was my home. My son was upstairs. And something about the cadence of those voices, the tone of authority, rang false. I unlatched the deadbolt slowly, leaving the chain lock intact. With a careful tug, I cracked the door open just enough to see who stood on the porch, and my gut clenched instantly. 4 men loomed there, tall and broad, blocking the morning light. Their dark blue jackets had large black letters stenciled across the back, HOA, Inspector. But their faces didn't match the title. Hard eyes, flat and hungry, scanned me without the slightest courtesy. Their arms bulged with muscle, tattoos creeping down from their sleeves like vines of ink. They didn't stand like inspectors, clipboard in hand, pen ready to nitpick about lawn length or paint color. No, they stood with legs planted, shoulders squared, weight balanced like wolves on my doorstep. The one in front, clearly the leader, stepped closer. He tilted his chin upward slightly, his stare fixed on mine, a subtle challenge. From his pocket, he pulled out a folded paper, held it up like it was a badge. His voice was cold steel scraping against concrete. "According to Clause 7B of the HOA bylaws, we have authority to detain any underage resident for a mandatory safety inspection." For a second, my mind stalled, the words tumbling around with no sense. Detain. Safety inspection. My jaw locked, fury starting to rise, but before I could form a single response, 2 of the men behind him shoved past me. They pushed the door wide with brute force and stormed into my house. "Hey!" I barked, spinning on my heel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" They ignored me. Their eyes had already locked on Ethan, my son. He was standing at the hallway entrance, barely awake in his rumpled t-shirt and flannel pajama pants, hair sticking out in every direction. He rubbed his eyes, confused, still half in the fog of sleep, and then he froze as one of the intruders reached him in 3 long strides, a tattooed hand snapping around his wrist like a clamp. Ethan yelped, startled, his voice breaking. "Dad, what's going on?" Sarah's scream cut through the chaos. She had stumbled from the kitchen, her face pale as she took in the sight of strangers manhandling her son. "They're taking him." "Stop them!" My chest heaved as I surged forward, but one of the brutes slammed his arm against me, shoving me back with enough force to knock the wind from my lungs. He leaned close, breath rancid with cigarettes, and hissed, "Step aside. This is authorized. Authorized." My voice cracked with rage. "You've got no damn authority in my house." The leader raised the crumpled paper higher, his expression ice cold. "Cooperation is mandatory. Non-compliance will be penalized." Ethan cried out as the man yanked him toward the front door, sneakers squealing against the hardwood as he fought against the pull. His terrified eyes darted toward me. "Dad, please." Sarah lunged toward them, but one of the men shoved her off like she was nothing, sending her stumbling into the counter. She gasped, pain twisting her face, tears already streaking down her cheeks. I felt something boil in me then, hotter than fire, sharper than steel, the kind of anger that drowns out pain, that pushes past fear. Every instinct screamed to act, to tear these men apart. I charged forward, fists clenched, but the second brute blocked me again, his voice a low growl. "One more step, old man, and you'll regret it. Old man." The insult cut, but it wasn't the words, it was the confidence. The way he said it told me he wasn't bluffing. The world seemed to narrow to a tunnel. Ethan being dragged, Sarah crying. These men, wolves in cheap jackets, staging their act for any neighbor who might look out the window. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, this wasn't about HOA bylaws. This wasn't about community rules. This was an ambush, and my son was the target. "Get your damn hands off my boy," I roared, surging forward again. The leader's lips curled into a thin smile. He snapped his fingers, and in that moment, my quiet suburban street became the staging ground for a war I hadn't realized was already at my doorstep. The words on the crumpled piece of paper burned into my vision. Clause 7B of the HOA bylaws. It was nonsense. I'd read the bylaws more times than I cared to admit, and there was no clause that granted anyone the right to lay hands on a child, let alone drag him screaming out of his own home. Yet the men in those dark jackets repeated the phrase like it was gospel, their voices low and commanding, designed to intimidate not just me, but anyone within earshot. Under Section 7B, Subsection 3, the leader intoned, his voice booming as if he were reading scripture. "Safety inspections are mandatory for minors. Failure to comply may result in penalties, fines, or forced relocation." Relocation. The word made my blood run cold. Sarah clutched her chest, her breaths ragged. Ethan thrashed, his sneakers squealing against the hardwood as he tried to twist free. "This is insane," I shouted, forcing myself forward despite the heavy arm of the brute blocking me. "There is no such clause. You're not inspectors, you're criminals." But the leader ignored me. He angled the fake document outward, waving it just enough so that when Mrs. Carver, our elderly neighbor across the street, looked up from watering her begonias, she saw something official-looking in his hand. He knew exactly what he was doing, and it worked. Mrs. Carver's eyes went wide. She clutched her robe to her chest, whispered, "Oh, dear Lord," and scurried back inside, slamming her door behind her. Another neighbor, Hank, shuffled out in his slippers with his morning paper, blinking through his thick glasses. He frowned at the scene but stayed frozen, uncertain. Official HOA inspection. The tattooed thug barked at him. "Stay back. Nothing to see here." Hank hesitated, his frown deepening, but he didn't move. The performance was effective. To any casual observer, it looked like uniformed officials handling a difficult family. And in a neighborhood ruled by reputation and whispers, the appearance of authority was often enough. Sarah's voice cracked through the morning air, shrill with panic. "Help us! Somebody call the sheriff! They're taking our son!" The leader turned his head slowly, his thin smile cutting deeper across his face. He raised the fake paper higher, ensuring the neighbors who peeked from behind curtains caught a glimpse. "Legal authority, safety protocols, compliance required." He repeated, his words deliberate, measured. My fists curled tighter, the muscles in my arms screaming for release. I wanted to break him where he stood, but something held me back, the realization that they were baiting me. They wanted me to lash out, to throw the first punch, to confirm the story they were spinning for anyone watching. Aggressive father attacks inspectors. Violent homeowner refuses compliance. It would all play right into their hands. Meanwhile, Ethan's cries grew louder, sharper, breaking. "Dad, don't let them take me." That sound, my boy's voice cracking, begging, snapped whatever restraint I had left. I lunged forward, grabbing the thug by the collar and yanking him back from Ethan. For the first time, surprise flickered in his eyes. He stumbled, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to jerk sideways. But before I could land a blow, a fist came crashing into my ribs from the side. White-hot pain ripped through me, dropping me to a knee. I gasped. The air punched out of my lungs. Sarah screamed my name, her voice raw. The leader stepped off the porch, calm as ice. He leaned down close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said evenly. "Compliance would have kept you safe. But now," his eyes flicked toward Ethan, who was still squirming in the thug's grip. "Now we'll have to teach the boy what happens when rules are broken." My vision blurred with fury. Over my dead body, I thought. The brute smirked, as if he could read the words in my eyes. "That can be arranged." Behind me, neighbors muttered in confusion. Some believed the jackets. Others whispered doubts. A woman's voice carried above the rest. "You're attacking officers of the law." The narrative was slipping away from me. I shoved myself upright despite the fire in my ribs. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From the barely contained rage building in my chest. I knew something then. Clear as the morning sun rising over our street, these men weren't here to fine us for grass length or mailbox paint. They weren't here for inspections. They were predators dressed in authority, counting on the HOA's reputation to mask their crime. And worse, they were organized. Their fake claws, their coordinated intimidation, the way they positioned themselves to block sightlines from certain windows, it all pointed to a rehearsed strategy. This wasn't their first attempt. Sarah was sobbing now, clutching at Ethan's free arm as the thug dragged him toward the threshold. My boy's sneakers squealed across the tile, his face pale, streaked with fear. His hand reached out desperately, fingers clawing the air toward me. I lunged again, ignoring the pain, ready to fight tooth and nail. My shoulder collided with the brute's chest, forcing him back a step. For a split second, Ethan slipped from his grasp. I wrapped my arm around my son, yanking him close, shielding him with my body. The leader's calm mask cracked just slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing across his features. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers once. That sound echoed like a death knell. The two men who had been holding back suddenly surged forward, their footsteps thunderous across my porch. The performance was over. They didn't care if the neighbors saw now. They had dropped the pretense of paperwork and rules. And in that instant, staring into the eyes of predators cloaked in authority, I knew we had crossed the threshold from intimidation to abduction. They weren't here to inspect. They weren't here to warn. They were here to take my son. And I swore to myself, with every fiber of who I was, they'd have to kill me before they succeeded. The air in the living room was split in half on one side. The chaos of strangers dragging my son toward the door. My wife sobbing as she clawed at their arms on the other. Me, pinned against the wall, ribs screaming, my fists clenched and useless. The leader's smirk widened, convinced he had already won. He thought intimidation had broken me. He thought the neighborhood's silence had sealed my fate. But then, from the kitchen, another sound cut through the madness. The quiet creak of a door opening. "You boys picked the wrong house," a calm, steady voice said, low but sharp enough to slice through the tension. Every head turned. 3 men stepped out of my kitchen, not strangers' brothers. Casual clothes, jeans, t-shirts, coffee mugs still in their hands. But their posture, their eyes, their very presence told the truth. These weren't civilians. These were Navy SEALs, my brothers in arms. Relief surged through my chest, nearly buckling my knees. Sarah froze, tears glistening on her cheeks, her breath hitching as she realized who they were. Ethan's wide, terrified eyes flicked from me to them, still trembling but clinging to the hope in their arrival. The intruders hesitated for the first time. Their performance had thrived on fear and confusion, but now their stage had been invaded by men who weren't buying the act. The tallest of the SEALs, Price, set his mug on the counter with deliberate calm. His lean frame was coiled like a spring. his eyes cold as winter steel. "Let the boy go." The thug holding Ethan tightened his grip, twisting my son's wrist until he cried out. "Back off," he snarled, his voice wavering just slightly. Price tilted his head, studying him as though examining a bug under glass. Then, with the faintest smirk, he stepped forward. "I wasn't asking." The leader scoffed, trying to reclaim authority. He held up the fake paper again, Clause 7B. But his words were cut short when Torres, the second SEAL, broad, dark-haired, built like a wall, moved with predator speed. In 2 strides, he was across the living room, his hand clamping onto the thug's wrist. With a sharp twist, a sickening crack echoed, and Ethan was free. The thug howled, collapsing as Torres forced him to the ground, face grinding into the hardwood. Sarah lunged, wrapping her arms around Ethan, pulling him to her chest. My boy buried his face against her, sobbing in shock. 2 seconds. Torres muttered, "He's down." The other thugs roared, charging forward. The tattooed brute who had smashed me in the ribs swung at Price, but Price sidestepped like it was choreographed, his elbow snapping into the man's ribs with surgical precision. The brute folded, gasping for breath, before Price hooked his leg and slammed him flat to the floor. The third intruder raised a knife from under his jacket, lunging toward me. My body tensed, but before I could react, Maddox, the third SEAL, lean and quiet, his eyes sharp as razors, caught the attacker mid-swing. With a fluid motion, he twisted the man's wrist, the knife clattering harmlessly to the ground. A moment later, the thug was pinned against the wall, arms locked behind his back in a brutal hold. It was like watching a storm dismantle everything in its path, precise and merciless. The leader cursed, stepping back toward the door. His calm mask was cracking. He had relied on fear, and now that fear was gone. He reached for something inside his jacket, another weapon, maybe, but Price's voice thundered across the room. "Don't!" The leader froze, his eyes flicking to the 3 SEALs now standing between him and freedom. For the first time, I saw doubt behind his bravado. The street outside was alive now. Neighbors had gathered, dozens of them, phones raised, recording, whispering in shock. To them, it must have looked like civilians attacking official inspectors. The jackets with bold HOA lettering had done their job. One woman cried out, "They're beating the inspectors." Another neighbor muttered, "Are we watching a crime?" Panic surged in me. If the story spun out wrong, if the neighbors believed the intruders, everything could collapse. Then, without breaking stride, Price reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open, the badge inside catching the morning sun. His voice was steady, commanding. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. These men are not inspectors. They are criminals, and they are under arrest." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones zoomed closer, recording the badge glinting in the light. Murmurs shifted doubt, disbelief, then realization. The neighbors' eyes widened, their whispers no longer against us but against the imposters. The leader snarled, his last weapon fear slipping from his grasp. He lunged toward the porch, but Torres blocked him with a shove that sent him crashing against the railing. Maddox snapped a zip tie tight around his wrists, the sharp snap echoing like a gunshot. And just like that, it was over. The 4 men lay sprawled on my floor and porch, hog-tied in neat rows. My ribs ached, my knuckles stung, but I was standing. Sarah cradled Ethan, rocking him gently, whispering comfort through tears. My boy was shaking, but he was free. For the first time in the nightmare morning, I exhaled. But as I looked at the bound men on my porch, their eyes still burning with hatred, I knew deep down this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. For a heartbeat, all I could hear was the ragged rhythm of my own breath and Ethan's muffled sobs against Sarah's chest. The intruders lay bound at our feet, but there was no relief. Not yet, because even tied down, they radiated menace, the kind that whispered, "This isn't finished." Price crouched low, his movements calm, deliberate, as if hog-tying violent men in a suburban living room was no more stressful than tying a shoelace. Torres checked the restraints, his thick arms pinning one thug until the plastic cuffs cut deep into his wrists. Maddox, always the quiet one, stood at the doorway, scanning the street with sharp, restless eyes. And the neighbors' God. The neighbors stood frozen on the sidewalks, pajamas and slippers, coffee mugs in hand, phones raised like weapons of their own, recording every second. Their faces reflected a swirl of confusion and fear, not sympathy. "They're attacking inspectors," a woman's voice cried from across the street. "I saw the jackets." "They're HOA," another man shouted back. No, that one had a badge. FBI. I saw it. The crowd swelled with noise, a storm of whispers, accusations, and doubt. "Stop filming," I barked, my voice hoarse. "These men are criminals. They tried to kidnap my son, but my words fell flat, smothered by the chaos. To them, truth wasn't as convincing as the staged uniforms, the fake documents. What they saw and what they believed were miles apart." Sarah held Ethan tighter, her knuckles white against his shirt. "John," she whispered, voice trembling, "they don't believe us." And she was right. I could see it in the way Mrs. Carver refused to meet my eyes, in the way Hank shuffled backward, clutching his newspaper like a shield. The neighbors weren't allies. They were witnesses, and some already thought we were the criminals. The leader of the intruders, still pinned by Torres, lifted his chin with a sick grin. Even cuffed, even beaten, he found the strength to sneer. "You think this ends here? We don't need authority. Fear is authority." Price leaned close, his knee pressing harder into the man's spine. "Not in this house," he growled. The man chuckled through gritted teeth, his words low enough only we could hear. "Doesn't matter. The neighborhood saw everything. By sundown, the board will be at your door, and when they come, it won't be with fists. It'll be with signatures and votes. That's power you can't fight." I wanted to smash his face into the porch until the smirk vanished, but Price stopped me with a steady hand on my shoulder. "Not now," he murmured. "He's right about one thing, this isn't over." But we don't play their game on the porch. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Red and blue lights soon flickered across the street, painting the neighborhood in pulsing color. Local deputies pulled up, stepping out with hands hovering near their holsters, eyes darting from the hog-tied men to the neighbors to the three strangers with FBI credentials. "What the hell happened here?" the deputy in front asked, his voice sharp, wary. Price stood tall, flipping his badge open again. His tone was clipped. "No room for argument. Federal operation in progress. Suspects are secured. Area is safe." The deputy hesitated, glancing at me, then at Sarah, clutching Ethan. His jaw tightened. He nodded once and barked orders to his men. Evidence bags, custody chains, transport vans. The scene dissolved into organized chaos. The imposters were hauled to their feet, still snarling and spitting curses. One of them locked eyes with me as he was shoved into a cruiser. His lips curled around three words that lodged in my chest like ice. "This isn't over." The phrase repeated in my skull as the cruisers pulled away, as the neighbors whispered louder, as Sarah wept quietly into Ethan's hair. The morning light felt wrong now, too bright, too clean, like a cruel contrast to the violence that had just scarred our home. When the last cruiser rolled down the street, the crowd didn't disperse. They lingered, filming, whispering, staring. To them, this was entertainment, gossip for the forum, fuel for the next HOA meeting. One woman finally said it out loud, sharp and accusing. If they weren't inspectors, why were they wearing HOA jackets? Why would real FBI be at John's house of all places? The question cut through me like a blade, because I didn't have an answer. Not yet. Ethan pulled away from Sarah just enough to look at me, his face pale, streaked with tears. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why did they want me? I didn't know. But I promised him the truth anyway." "They're never going to touch you again," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "Not while I'm breathing." Behind me, Price, Torres, and Maddox exchanged a glance, a silent soldier's conversation. They knew more than they were saying. They always did. The neighbors drifted back to their homes eventually, but not with relief. They left with questions, suspicions, stories already mutating in their minds. I could feel it by nightfall. The HOA forum would be full of rumors, each more twisted than the last. And as I closed the front door, locking it tight, I realized something chilling. The fight on the porch was over, but the real battle, the one waged not with fists, but with whispers, votes, and bylaws, was just beginning. And this neighborhood, it wasn't on my side. The house smelled of sweat, fear, and broken trust. Sarah sat on the couch with Ethan in her arms, rocking him like he was 5 again instead of 15. His tears had dried into streaks across his cheeks, his face pale and hollow, eyes wide like a cornered animal. Every time the front gate creaked or a car engine hummed down the street, he flinched. My boy, who once laughed so loud it woke the neighbors, now trembled at shadows. Price stood at the dining table, the badge he'd flashed outside lying face up on the wood, gleaming in the light. Torres leaned against the counter, arms crossed, still brimming with restrained energy, while Maddox scribbled notes into a small, battered notebook. They weren't just calming down after a fight. They were working, already piecing together the bigger picture. I paced, ribs aching from the earlier blow. My voice came out harsher than I intended. What the hell just happened here? Who were they? Why, my son Price looked up, his gaze calm but hard as granite. You already know. John. They weren't inspectors. They weren't even neighbors. They're part of something larger, a network. Network, Sarah's voice cracked. She pulled Ethan tighter against her, her trembling hand brushing his hair back. They broke into our home and tried to drag our child away. You're telling me there's more of them? Maddox closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. Plenty more. This wasn't random. These men operate under the cover of HOAs, code inspectors, sometimes even utility workers. They use uniforms, fake paperwork, and authority masks to disarm people. Families don't resist when they think it's official, and when they walk out with a kid in their grip, everyone assumes it's legal. I clenched my fists until my nails bit my palms. So, they target families. For what Ransom Price's lips pressed into a thin line. Worse, these groups are linked to trafficking networks across multiple counties. They've perfected the art of vanishing children without raising alarms. By the time a family realizes what happened, local authorities are convinced it's a runaway situation. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan's eyes darted to me, his voice breaking. Dad, was I supposed to be one of them? Was I? No! I dropped to my knees in front of him, gripping his shoulders firmly. Listen to me, son. None of this is your fault. They came for you, but that's on them, not you. My voice cracked despite my effort to stay strong. You're not to blame. Torres stepped forward, his deep voice filling the silence. He's right. They don't pick at random. Someone gave them Ethan's name. Someone who knows this neighborhood. Someone with access to the HOA rosters, school schedules, even door codes. The realization sank in like poison. Inside, help. Betrayal. My chest tightened. You're saying someone here, one of our own neighbors, fed them information Price didn't blink? Yes. The HOA isn't just incompetent, it's compromised. The room tilted. For years, I had thought of the HOA as a nuisance letters about grass height, passive-aggressive notes about trash cans, empty threats about community standards. Annoying, sure, but dangerous never. And yet, the men who had tried to drag my son out of my house this morning hadn't just known Ethan's name. They had known the perfect time to strike. They'd counted on neighbors watching, believing their act, even helping silence us with suspicion. Who, I demanded, my voice low. Dangerous. Who gave them my boy's name? Price's jaw tightened. We're still working on it. But Harris, your HOA president, has been flagged in federal chatter before. Offshore accounts. Odd wire transfers. We can't confirm yet, but he's on the list. I felt the blood drain from my face. Harris, the man who shook my hand at every HOA meeting, who smiled as he collected dues, who joked at barbecues, gave Ethan a Christmas card last year. Sarah shook her head violently, disbelief and horror twisting her features. No. Harris, he's lived across the street for years. He babysat our dog when we traveled. She broke off, unable to finish. The betrayal too sharp. Ethan's small voice cut through the silence. He waved at me yesterday, right before school. His lip quivered. He smiled. I slammed my fist against the table so hard the badge rattled. smiled while feeding our son's name to animals. My voice trembled with rage. Price's eyes locked on mine, steady and cold. If Harris is dirty, we can't move too soon. We need him to lead us up the chain. If we grab him now, the rest scatter underground. That's your job, I snapped, barely containing my fury. Mine is protecting my family. And I'll be damned if I let a man across the street sip sweet tea on his porch while plotting my son's abduction. The room fell into a tense silence. Sarah's tears streaked her face as she whispered, "John, what if they come back? What if next time you're not here?" Her grip on Ethan tightened until he whimpered softly. Price slid the badge back into his pocket, his voice level but heavy with steel. "They will come back. That's what you need to understand. Today wasn't an inspection. It was a test. They were probing your defenses. You're on their list now. And until we take down the network, your boy is a target." Outside, muffled voices of neighbors still lingered, the rumor mill already grinding. Through the blinds, I caught sight of curtains twitching, silhouettes craning to watch. Phones glowed in hands. No one was knocking to check if we were safe. No one was bringing comfort food or solidarity. They were recording, whispering, spinning their own stories. And that was when it hit me. Sharper than any fist to the ribs, we weren't just fighting thugs in fake jackets. We were fighting perception, rumor, authority twisted into theater. And in this war, the battlefield wasn't just my porch. It was the entire neighborhood. I turned back to Sarah and Ethan, my voice low but certain. "Then let them come. They'll find out this family doesn't break." Price's gaze softened just a fraction, but his words carried warning. "John, you'd better mean that, because the storm hasn't even started yet." And deep down, in the marrow of my bones, I knew he was right. By late afternoon, the house no longer felt like ours. Agents rotated outside in unmarked sedans, their silhouettes barely visible through tinted glass. Price had promised they'd keep watch, but their presence was both comfort and reminder we weren't safe. Sarah moved like a ghost, her hands shaking as she tried to make dinner no one wanted to eat. Ethan sat at the table, pushing peas around his plate, his eyes darting to every sound, each creak of the floorboards, each car passing outside. The neighbors, meanwhile, had transformed. Our quiet street, once a row of tidy lawns, porch flags, and friendly waves, was now a stage. Curtains twitched. Phones glowed. Conversation stopped whenever I stepped onto the porch. The whispers were louder, no longer afraid of being overheard. They attacked inspectors. The boy was resisting. Something illegal is going on in that house. Rumors swirled faster than the truth could keep up. At dusk, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, insistent. Sarah jumped, dropping the plate she held. It shattered on the tile. Ethan flinched so hard his chair scraped against the floor. I moved to the door, checking the peephole. 3 figures stood there, not thugs in tattoos this time, but familiar faces. Harris, the HOA president, flanked by Mrs. Danner and a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Leal. Retirees in polo shirts, khakis, and pressed blouses, holding clipboards like they were shields. I opened the door just enough to block their view of the inside. My voice came out like gravel. "What do you want?" Harris adjusted his glasses, his expression flat, rehearsed. "John, we've had multiple reports of disturbance today. Several residents claim law enforcement was attacked on your property. We need to address this." Behind him, Mrs. Danner pursed her lips so tightly they almost disappeared. "Some neighbors say your son assaulted inspectors. Others say your guests, whoever they were, used violence against officials. Either way, the community deserves answers." My chest tightened. I scanned their faces, searching for a flicker of doubt, of humanity, but all I saw was calculation. You saw what happened. They weren't inspectors. They broke into my home. They tried to take Ethan. That's not what it looked like on the video. Mrs. Danner sniffed. My blood froze. What video? Harris cleared his throat, pretending neutrality, but his eyes glimmered with something colder. "A resident filmed the altercation. It's already circulating on the HOA forum. From the angles shown, it appears that your guests assaulted men in uniform. The board is obligated to act." Sarah's voice rang out from behind me, sharp and incredulous. Officials, they had tattoos crawling up their arms. They reeked of cigarettes. They shoved me into a counter. They tried to kidnap my son, and you call them officials. But Harris only raised a hand like a judge, silencing an objection. We're not here to debate facts. We're here to remind you of the bylaws. Section 12. A residence must not engage in conduct that disrupts the peace or reputation of the community. Violations will not be tolerated. I felt my jaw tighten until it ached. So, instead of protecting families, you're worried about your reputation. Mrs. Danner's eyes slid past me, landing on Ethan where he hovered near the stairs, clutching the banister like it might hold him up. Her tone softened, but it was rehearsed, artificial. We just want to make sure the boy is safe. Perhaps a temporary relocation would calm tensions. For everyone's benefit, Ethan shrank back instantly, pressing against Sarah's side. His voice came out in a whisper, cracked with fear. "Dad, I don't want to go." I stepped forward, filling the doorway, my voice low and dangerous. "You're not taking him anywhere." The third board member, Lael, finally spoke. His tone was quieter but colder. "John, tensions are high. If you cooperate, we can de-escalate. If you refuse, well, the board has authority to escalate matters formally." The implication hung in the air. Fines, liens, eviction proceedings, even custody recommendations, bureaucratic weapons sharper than knives. I didn't miss the threat. Neither did Sarah. She pulled Ethan closer, whispering, "John, please, don't." My blood burned like fire, but I forced myself to shut the door. My hands trembled as the latch clicked into place. Through the wood, I heard Harris's calm voice murmur, "This isn't over." Their footsteps retreated down the walkway. Inside, silence collapsed over us, thicker than before. Sarah turned on me, her eyes wide with panic. "They're turning the whole neighborhood against us. First those thugs, now the board. What if this was the plan all along, to isolate us?" Ethan hugged himself, whispering, "Everyone hates us now." I dropped to a knee in front of him, gripping his shoulders tight. "Listen to me, son. They don't get to decide who we are. They don't get to take you. Not while I'm still breathing." But even as I said it, I felt the truth gnawing at me. The SEALs had warned us the network had inside help. And now the HOA wasn't just complicit, it was weaponized. That night, unmarked federal cars idled at the corners of our block. Phones lit up across the street as neighbors posted and speculated. Our fortress had become a fishbowl, and the wolves were circling. At 9 p.m., the low buzz of a drone began above our roofline. Its red and green lights blinked like a predator's eye. A black SUV parked at the end of the street, engine humming low, not moving. Ethan whispered from the window, "Dad, are they coming back?" I pulled him close, my voice steady even though my gut twisted with rage. "Not tonight, son. Not while I'm here." But my words felt thin against the drone's mocking hum. The war had shifted. No longer fists on the porch. Now it was rumors, bylaws, surveillance, intimidation. And I realized with a cold clarity this wasn't just a fight to save my son. This was a fight to survive in my own neighborhood. The days that followed felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Every time Sarah peeked through the blinds, someone was there, neighbors whispering on the sidewalk, cars slowing as they passed, eyes lingering too long. Ethan refused to sleep alone. He carried his blanket downstairs every night, curling on the couch where he could see me pacing the living room like a guard dog. The boy who used to dream of baseball games and comic books now jolted awake at the faintest hum of an engine. But the worst wasn't the silence of the neighbors or the buzzing drones. It was the envelope that appeared in our mailbox. Official HOA letterhead, stamped in bold ink, notice of violation. Harris's signature at the bottom. The words cut like blades, failure to cooperate with inspectors, conduct disruptive to community peace, further disciplinary measures to be considered. Sarah read it aloud, her voice trembling. Ethan burst into tears, clinging to her. And me. I crumpled the paper in my fist until it shredded, my knuckles white. They think they can bury us in bylaws. I growled. They've forgotten who they're dealing with. That night, Price returned with Torres and Maddox. They didn't knock loud, just a discreet tap. like soldiers slipping into enemy territory. Price laid a folder on the table. His eyes were cold, his voice measured. Harris scheduled an emergency HOA meeting. Agenda says it's about your violations, but chatter we intercepted says otherwise. That meeting is the handoff. Handoff, I demanded. Price nodded grimly. He's supposed to pass Ethan's file to their buyer. Someone higher up the chain. Sarah went pale, her hands shaking as she grabbed Ethan. You mean they'll be sitting in the same room as us, Harris? And whoever he's selling our son to? Yes, Price said simply. And that's our chance to catch them in the act. Torres leaned forward, his deep voice steady. We'll be inside, disguised as residents. Khakis, polos, name tags. Under the table. We'll be armed. If they move, we move faster. My gut twisted. You're saying my son has to sit in the same room as the man who tried to sell him? Price met my gaze, unflinching. If Harris doesn't see Ethan, he'll know something's wrong. The deal dies. The rest scatter. And your neighborhood stays a hunting ground. Ethan had been silent until then. But now his voice broke through, sharp with a kind of anger too old for his years. So I just pretend nothing happened. Pretend he didn't try to take me. I crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder. No, son, we don't pretend. We endure until it's time to strike. 3 nights later, the community center smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee. Normally, only a dozen board members showed up. Tonight, the room was packed with nearly 50 residents, some curious, some eager for drama, some whispering their judgments before anything began. Sarah sat beside me, Ethan between us, Price, Torres, and Maddox scattered through the room, disguised as neighbors, polos tucked neatly, plastic name tags clipped to their collars. No one would know they were trained to end a fight in seconds. At the front, Harris straightened his tie, his smile stretched too wide. He tapped the microphone like a man trying to look important. Good evening, neighbors. Tonight we must discuss a serious matter of compliance. Certain families his gaze slid to us, dripping venom, have repeatedly defied inspections and disrupted harmony. Our bylaws are clear. Enforcement is necessary. Whispers rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others looked uneasy. I felt Sarah's grip tighten on Ethan's arm. My own pulse hammered like a war drum. Then Harris pulled out a thick manila folder, our names scrawled on the front in block letters. My stomach dropped. The file. This folder contains documented violations, Harris declared. It will be transferred to the appropriate parties for review and further action. The side door creaked. Every head turned. A man slipped inside, tall, wearing a suit too sharp for a neighborhood meeting. Sunglasses indoors, a scar jagged across his jaw. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't HOA. He was the buyer. Sarah's breath hitched. Ethan's fingers dug into my arm. Across the room. Price's gaze flicked from me to the man, then back. A silent signal. This is it. Harris extended the folder. The buyer reached for it. That single motion, the pass of paper between hands, felt heavier than a gunshot. It was betrayal in ink and cardboard. Years of fake smiles, polite waves, summer barbecues, all undone in one treacherous handoff. I half rose from my chair, rage boiling over. But before I could speak, Price's voice thundered from the back of the room. Stop federal agents' hands where I can see them. The room exploded into chaos. Gasps, screams, chairs scraping, neighbors shouting in confusion. Harris froze, folder still in hand. The buyer reached under his jacket, but Torres was faster, slamming him to the floor in 2 blinding steps. Maddox pinned Harris against the podium, wrenching the folder from his grip. Federal arrest. Price barked, his badge flashing under the fluorescent lights. The room erupted in disbelief. What's going on? He's the president. They're cops. I saw their jackets, but before truth could settle, the lights died. The room plunged into choking blackness. Then came the sound I had prayed never to hear again in a suburban community hall, the staccato rattle of automatic gunfire. Short, sharp bursts, warning shots, enough to shake the walls, to send civilians diving under tables. Shadows moved outside the broken windows. More men, black masks, rifles. Not imposters this time, not actors, operators. They hadn't come to argue bylaws. They had come to erase us all. Everyone down, Price barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. I grabbed Sarah and Ethan, pulling them behind the podium as chairs toppled and neighbors screamed, heart pounding. I scanned the exits. Every door slammed shut from the outside. Trapped. The war we thought was a courtroom drama had just turned into a battlefield, and we were right in the middle of it. The gunfire rattled the windows, each burst echoing like thunder inside the small community hall. Neighbors screamed, scrambling beneath folding tables, coffee spilling, chairs toppling. Sarah clutched Ethan to her chest. Both of them pressed against the podium while I dragged a table to brace the door. My ribs screamed in protest, but adrenaline drowned the pain. Price moved like a storm in the dark. His voice cut through the panic, low and commanding. Barricade the doors. Stay low. Torres and Maddox flanked him, their tactical flashlights slicing the blackness into narrow beams. For a moment, the room looked like a war zone, flashes of light catching terrified faces, dust dancing in the beams, shadows shifting at the broken windows. I hadn't held a rifle in years, but when one of the attackers shoved his way through the side door, instincts buried deep roared back to life. He raised his weapon, a black silhouette in the chaos. Before he could fire, Torres slammed into him like a freight train, wrenching the rifle free and twisting his arms behind his back. Plastic cuffs snapped in place in less than 3 seconds, but more were coming. Glass shattered at the back of the hall. 2 masked gunmen climbed through, rifles up. Without thinking, I grabbed the weapon Torres had just stripped away. The weight felt like an old friend, familiar and heavy. My shoulder remembered what to do even before my brain caught up. Breath steady, short bursts. The first man fell instantly, crumpling against a chair. The second hesitated, eyes widening in surprise just long enough for Maddox's shot to tear through the dark and drop him cold. Screams rose from the civilians. People prayed, cried, begged. This wasn't the HOA dispute they came for, it was war. Sarah's voice cut through the noise, trembling but fierce. "John, over here." She shielded Ethan, her body curled protectively over him as bullets sparked against the podium. My heart hammered at the sight of them huddled in fear. My family, my reason. I fired again, forcing the gunman back through the window. My vision tunneled, the way it used to in combat zones, each movement sharp, each sound magnified, every second carrying the weight of life or death. "This isn't a raid," Price growled between bursts of gunfire. "It's a cleanup. They want Harris, the buyer, and every witness gone, pinned beneath Torres." Harris writhed, spitting curses. "You don't know who you're dealing with. They'll burn this block to the ground before they let you win." Price pressed a knee into his back, harder, his voice steel. "We know exactly who we're dealing with." 20 minutes, maybe 30. Time lost meaning in the firefight. Every shadow outside became a target. Every creak of boots against tile a warning. But slowly, the assault tapered. The shots grew distant. The masked figures retreated into the night. "They're regrouping," Maddox muttered, peering through a crack in the barricade. "Not retreating." Price nodded. "This isn't their last move." The decision was made in that moment. We couldn't keep waiting for them to come to us. We had to take the fight to them. The next night, I found myself in the back of a white van that smelled of oil and steel, flanked by Price, Torres, and Maddox. Sarah had begged me not to go, tears streaming down her face, but there was no choice. This wasn't just about us anymore. If the network wasn't stopped, other families, other kids would vanish. Ethan had looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and whispered, "Come back, Dad." That promise burned hotter than fear. The warehouse was 3 miles out, squatting between a scrapyard and an abandoned auto shop. From the outside, it looked forgotten rusted siding, busted windows, graffiti sprawled across the walls. But the heat signatures on Price's tablet told the truth, at least 30 men inside, rotating in shifts. Harris hadn't been exaggerating. "This is their nest," Torres said grimly. We moved in silence, boots crunching gravel, rifles low. Maddox clipped the lock on the side entrance, the door groaning open like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the air stank of cigarettes and oil. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Then came the signal. A flashbang through the doorway. White light. a thunderclap that rattled the rafters, and then chaos. The SEALs stormed the room with precision, cutting through the startled men before they could even raise their weapons. Shouts, curses, gunfire snapping. 2 down before the first smoke cleared. I hugged the wall, firing in short bursts at shadows scrambling for cover. One man lunged with a blade, too close to aim. I slammed the butt of my rifle into his jaw, felt bone crunch, and shoved him to the ground. Torres flipped a table, scattering maps and fake HOA paperwork. "They're running this like a cartel," he muttered, stuffing documents into a pack. Layers of cover, neighborhoods, bylaws, all a mask. The fight spilled into the corridor. Sparks rained from torn wiring. Bullets chewed plaster. My ribs burned, but adrenaline carried me forward. And then we found him. At the center of the warehouse stood a broad-shouldered man in a black mask, taller than the rest. Unlike his soldiers, he carried no rifle, only a pistol, dangling casually at his side. His voice boomed beneath the rafters. "So, you're the ones who embarrassed my men." Price leveled his weapon. "Drop it. It's over." The man chuckled, low and cold. "Over. You think this was about your boy?" He tilted his head, eyes glinting behind the mask. He was leverage, a test. HOA was just a shell. We're in cities all over this country. Every neighborhood, every rule. We own fear. His finger twitched. The pistol rose. I shoved Price aside as the shot cracked. Fire tore across my ribs, the bullet grazing flesh. Pain exploded, but I stayed upright. And then a voice rang out above us. "Hey," I looked up. My heart nearly stopped. "Ethan!" He stood on the catwalk, small and trembling, but defiant. In his hands was the flashlight Price had given him for safety. He flicked it on, blinding the masked commander with a searing beam. For one split second, the man faltered. Price didn't. His shot rang out, clean and precise. The masked man staggered, pistol clattering to the concrete before he collapsed in a heap. Silence. Heavy. Final. The shutters lifted minutes later as federal backup stormed in, sirens cutting the night. Surviving gunmen were dragged out in cuffs, their empire crumbling in the light of flood lamps. I staggered, clutching my bleeding side. As Ethan scrambled down the ladder, he ran into my arms, shaking but alive. I buried my face in his hair, whispering, "You saved me." His voice cracked, but steady. "No. Dad, we saved each other." Sarah's sobs filled the space as she wrapped us both in her arms. For the first time in weeks, the weight lifted. The nightmare was ending. Price clapped a firm hand on my shoulder. His eyes were tired but steady. "It's done. But remember, fear wears many uniforms. Stay sharp." I nodded, my gaze on Ethan. "I will." Because I understood something now. Something I'd never forget. Evil doesn't always come with ski masks and rifles. Sometimes it comes in a jacket stamped HOA inspector, knocking on your door at 7 in the morning. And as long as I breathed, no one would ever take my family again. Sometimes life teaches us that danger doesn't always come wearing a mask. It can come disguised as authority, as neighbors, even as rules written on paper. This story isn't just about fighting back with fists or weapons. It's about standing up for what truly matters, protecting family, refusing to bow to fear, and remembering that real strength is measured not by power, but by courage and love. And maybe that's the lesson here when the world feels stacked against you, when whispers and lies surround you. Hold fast to the people you love. That bond is stronger than fear, stronger than betrayal, and it's what keeps us human. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up when it felt like everyone was against you? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss another tale of courage, conflict, and justice.